on our schedule. We have today and Friday to finish up this module. And we have the part 4, although I think it's listed as, yeah, part 3 and 4 homework that's due tonight. Okay, so last time we started talking about part 5. There were a couple questions on there about this list of comparable stuff that we utilized in part 2, like figuring out the highest pledge level. We can essentially just eyeball it. That $6,000 is going to be the highest one and see that only one person gave that amount there. And then for projects that gave at least $100, again, you could eyeball it if you want, but essentially, there's 100, there's one, all the way down until that guy. That's the only one that doesn't have a pledge level over $100. There is a way to automate it, but not super important. So what I do want to talk about is this guy wanted to know the percent of backers who gave at least $100. And so we are essentially adding up these people down here, but only if they correspond to a pledge level of $100 or more. And so that's when I mentioned that you can use the sum ifs function on these two parts to see that 442 of these numbers down here correspond to pledge levels of $100 or more. And then we can add up all the people and divide these two numbers to get the actual percent we are interested in. Then the question in part 5, we left off last time with a little bit of algebra, where we were essentially taking these 4 bullet points that were in the workbook and converting them to equations. I left you with this one right here. That percentage that we just talked about was equal to these 3 probabilities added up. But then we got 2 more equations from the final 2 bullet points. For instance, they're saying the probability of getting exactly 1, which is represented by a B, is double the probability of getting exactly 2, which is represented by a C. So we have this equation. We know that B, whatever it is 2 times whatever C is. Likewise, they tell us that the probability of getting exactly 3 is equal to the probability of getting exactly 2. That's these 2 variables, which leaves us with a third equation. Now, essentially what you can do is use substitution to solve this equation here, which currently has 3 variables. And you can say, oh, I can replace B with this second equation, and I can replace D with this third equation. And now it looks like that. This 4.82 that we got in the second question is equal to 2C plus C plus C, which essentially means there's 4 of those C's over on the right. It looks like that, which means we can divide both sides by 4, and we can actually solve for one of these probabilities. Then to finish, since we now know what C is, we know what D is, and we know what B is, and A is just essentially all the rest of the probabilities that we were missing. So that allows us to solve for these 4 probabilities. We can also fill in the value of each of these scenarios because they're each $250 pledge levels. So it's just essentially saying, how much money you're going to get if this many people give you $250. So that's how we get those values. And then we can compute the expected value the exact same way you did the part 0 homework questions, which were essentially weighted average. So like this guy times this guy, this one times this one, and then all added up, which means you can just use a sum product to get there a little quicker. So that was the last question in part 5. What we're working on today is part 6, and it's another one where we don't really have any tables set up yet in our spreadsheet, so we're gonna have to build most of this from scratch. However, it is gonna rely on a calculator we have already built. It's going to have us go back to that part 2 calculator with Sarah and Matt, and we plugged in 500 backers to see how much money they would raise. We're gonna use that calculator, and we're gonna consider 2 other scenarios. So this 500 backers case is going to be considered the base case. We're also going to consider a pessimistic scenario where, okay, maybe we don't get 500 backers, maybe we only get 200 backers. And then last of all, an optimistic scenario where we get 1,200 backers. And so in the first part of these two questions, we're just going to see how much money is pledged in those two scenarios. So we already have a calculator that can do that for us. For the second question, they ask if we can afford the mold. So essentially, you are just looking at your answer to A and seeing if you raised at least $15,000. And then for C, what we're doing is going back to our work in part 4, where we decided, hey, if we're going to use the mold, if we can afford it, we should use a $30 price point. But if we can't afford the mold, we should use a $40 price point. So again, it's using information we've already figured out from previous parts. And so that's how to answer these first two questions. And then the final question is another expected value question, where this one's a little bit easier, I would say, than part 5, because they give you the probabilities. And the only trick to this question is they're not asking the expected value of money pledged, which would be the numbers we got up here. They're asking the expected value of money collected. And remember from part 1, the only difference between pledged versus collected is if you don't meet the funding goal, you collect 0, because the website Kickstarter would just send it back to everyone. And so you're going to use those numbers in your final calculation of this last expected value. Oh, and then one last thing that I forgot to mention, that this algebra that we went through together, super annoying. Don't worry about that so much. If you got it, that's great, but it's not really reflective of what you should be expected to do on an exam. If you want to see a good example of this type of question that you should prepare for, check out the second question on the parts 5 and 6 homework. It's a much more realistic approach to this type of question that doesn't require you to do crazy algebra. It might be a little bit, but not as much as this question.